It's a pleasure to talk today with Professor Dr. Dirk Messner about a question which is keeping us busy as Mesopartner since quite some time. It's a question on how we can promote more sustainable, transformative development, local economic development within the cities and the regions where we are working. Dr. Dirk Messner has headed the German Development Institute, a think tank, the German think tank on development policies, especially also related to developing countries. He also co-headed and was member of the Advisory Council on Global Change of the German government, also 15 years. And he's now heading the German Development Agency, which is I would say, most influential policy advising agency in Germany on how the country can promote a more transformative, a more environmental friendly development future. We're looking forward to this conversation with him. It's very nice to talk to you today, Dirk, about a question which which keeps us very busy since quite some time now, the question of how can we as Mesopartner promote a more sustainable, transformative approach to local economic development in the locations where we are working. You know that we as Mesopartner, we work strongly on this topic of local economic development, with a strong focus on developing countries, also on this issue of how can we promote innovation systems in locations and regions. And yes, and there always a question comes in, a systemic approach is important. But also nowadays, we also have to think about how can we promote a more, let's say, sustainability oriented approach. And that is a question which we are thinking about. We both had contact since more than 20 years now. I was your student, actually. You were encouraging me to go to Chile to write my thesis on the economic development in that country. But you also co-developed the systemic competitiveness approach, an approach which you co-developed with also with Dr. Dirk Messner, the founder of Mesopartner, and other colleagues from the German Development Institute. And for us, this was for a long time a framework which we worked also with on local economic development. And it was for us a kind of opportunity to take a systemic approach, a systemic perspective on our development. But apart from this approach, also we now, together with you, we as Mesopartner had an event last year with former research colleagues, which we know, both of us, where we reflected on the question, how can we encourage a human-centered development approach? Also putting this issue or this topic of competitiveness into question, keeping the systemic perspective, but thinking about what are the future requirements. And because you know that we are coming from this very much bottom-up approach, thinking about how we can strengthen the resilience of these locations where we are working. And I would like to come to the first question to you, because you are now very strongly reflecting on this question on transformative development in Germany. Where do you see, what is the role or what is the importance and role of cities, not so much metropolitan cities, but also smaller cities, rural regions, to make this actually this sustainable transformation reality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my first point would be that most people are still living in small and medium-sized cities. This is not only true in Germany, which is a very decentralized country, but also if you look globally, we have a huge debate on megacities, and we are neglecting that most people also in the future will live in medium and smaller sized cities. So this is the first point. For empirical reasons, we should look at locations which are of relevance, and medium and small sized cities are of relevance. The second observation would be that it's interesting to see that larger cities drive innovation. So if you look at headquarters of big companies being based mainly in big cities, and financial capital being centralized in large cities only. But what we also see historically and recently is that medium-sized cities always have innovative capacities. If you look into the past, remember Weimar, which was the city of Goethe and Schiller. It was not Berlin. So They lived in Weimar, in a small and medium-sized city, or if you remember the Bauhaus movement. So this movement which tried to reimagine cities and architecture, and how cities, architecture, and styles of living, modern styles of living, could be combined and shaped in a different way. Dessau was the heart of that. No? And again, this is a very small-sized city. Today we have in Dessau, where I do have one of my offices, 1,000 people living. So it's a small city, but it was the center of a movement with global impacts at the end of the day. No? So, and you have been working, Frank, on industrial districts in Italy. And they have been very competitive, very dynamic, and again, small-sized cities. No? So decentralization drives innovation and knowledge processes. And my last point is that I think the key to bring together the capabilities and the strengths of larger cities, and then the innovative capacities and potentials of smaller cities, a polycentric perspective is important. So what I do not like to see in countries is centralization. So if you look at, we have been debating very often, you talked about Chile, where you have been working. No? So Chile is a very centralized country with many disadvantages, therefore, because you have to live in the capital. If you don't, you do not have access to culture, to education, to universities, to power networks, to everything else. No? So centralization is not the pattern I like most. No? And then the second pattern, which I do not like, is fragmentation. So you do have different types of cities and capitals within a country, but not well connected, fragmented. No? And if you are not connected, you do not learn together. You do not develop, you only develop your isolated urban area or city. No? And then the third perspective, which I prefer, is polycentrism. And polycentrism implies that you connect the dots and pieces, you connect cities, larger ones and smaller ones. So the systems between the cities, which connect the cities, are very important. Mobility systems, for example. And then you should invest from a cultural perspective, an R&D perspective, innovation perspective, education perspective, also in smaller and medium-sized cities. And this is what does not happen in many countries. No? And therefore, I'm a fan of polycentristic perspectives.
When you look at the transformation requirements at these cities and regions, but also transformation requirements to connect, you said, you made that point strong, to connect cities and, let's say, more smaller urban areas. What are the transformation requirements when you see it now from your perspective on a sustainable transformation point of view? Where do you see main entry points when it comes to this question? Because we realize that in our work, that we are often also now trying to figure out what this means also for our practical work.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability transformations are, of course, about innovation, and innovation is also about technology. So technology is one entry point. No? And we could talk about this maybe during the next minutes to come, but my main point would be that sustainability transformations move beyond, or need to move beyond, technological innovations. No? It needs to shift entire societies at the end of the day, no? Because we want to build circular economies. Nowadays in Europe, we only recycle 14% for 4 decades already, no, of our resources. But what we would like to see is a complete circular economy. So a lot of room for improvement. Then we want to decarbonize our economies towards 2050 at the latest. And this implies everywhere halving emissions decade per decade. So this is beyond incremental change. It is fundamental change. No? And I use, for analyzing societal transformation in societies, I use the actor-oriented institutionalism, which has been developed by the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. For me, it explains well what you have to look at if you try to understand shifts in patterns of entire societies. No? And they are looking at 4, they call this streams. They are looking at 4 streams. So the first stream is that look at actors. No? So from a decarbonization perspective, is the number of actors, of firms, of universities focusing on decarbonization and climate-oriented development is the number of these actors growing, no? And how can we support the number of these actors moving into this direction? This is about power play, actually. No? So we need more and more actors moving into the direction of decarbonization. No? So actors is the first thing. And the second thing is then that we need to develop new cognitive concepts. We are working to reduce complexity. We have in our societies cognitive concepts, no? Heuristics. Lou Frank has been working for many years with the concept of systemic competitiveness. It's also a heuristic. No? And regarding sustainability, the important thing is that we need new concepts which drive thinking and investments and consumer decision-making processes also. I would like to focus only on one of those. No? Decarbonization is such a concept. No? So a zero carbon economy in 2050. Well, this is very different from the old development models we worked with. And this is a new cognitive concept which emerged during the last 15 years, actually. Because during the first years of climate debates in the 80s and the 90s, scholars talked about reducing emissions without linking this to new business models. No? Only after the climate negotiation in 2009 in Copenhagen, which failed, the debate about how does actually a climate-compatible economy look like emerged. So the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which I had the pleasure to head, and the OECD and the World Bank, in 2010 and 11, the first wave of studies on decarbonizing our economies, no? A zero carbon economy emerged. This is a new cognitive concept, a new heuristic, and I see progresses here. No? Because if you look at the Corona crisis now, there are strong links between the debate about how to organize the recovery of our economy and decarbonize at the same time. No? This did not happen 10 years ago in the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. When the crisis started, the financial crisis, all concepts about climate orientation and environmental policy disappeared. No? This time it's different. So we have progress here. No? So this is the second. The third element, which is important, is policy regimes. So you have to build the new cognitive concepts and the new objectives of development into the policy regimes. And I see hybrids here. So we still have 350 billion euros as subsidies for burning fossil fuels and strong investments in and incentives for renewable energy. So it's a hybrid situation. We are still not there. A lot of work to do. And the last element where I also see problems is the normative dimensions of our societies. So we had the welfare state. So social justice in our societies, no? and reducing inequalities in our societies was very important in Europe, at least, during the last 5-6 decades after Second World War. No? And now we need, from a sustainability perspective, beyond social justice in our own societies, we need a new set of normative aspects. No? And the three most important ones are Earth system stability needs to be an imperative for our decision-making processes. Earth system stability. No one thought about Earth system stability during the last 250,000 years, but now we have. No? And then if you think about global decarbonization, it is about global justice problems. No? Who is going to pay these transformation processes? Because this is linked to cost and benefit sharing. No? And the last element what we need to understand in our societies is the way we decide during the next 2 decades regarding decarbonization or rapid decarbonization or slower decarbonization, this has impacts for all generations to come. And this is also a new normative horizon, right?
Yeah. It sounds like an agenda which is has to be very strongly driven at the national level, but also at the international level. Where do you see the requirements at the local level from a bottom-up perspective? Because I could imagine that there are different dynamics which have to come together from at the national level to really change social mindsets, a more kind of Earth system perspective. But our question is, what is the importance from a bottom-up perspective? What is required there? I agree with the actors and the cognitive concepts, but often the question is, do you see a special role there at a territorial or a special role from a bottom-up perspective to really realize these different aspects which you mentioned?
I mean, if you look at these 4 dimensions or streams, no, 3 of them are obviously relevant on local, regional, and national levels. No? So having actors driving into this direction is of importance at any level. No? And yes, many decisions need to be made in cities when it comes to mobility systems and buildings and so on. So actors at any level. No? Normative perspectives, it is important that this is not only an elite project, so at many levels. No? And the third element, which I talked about, cognitive concept, this is also something which needs to gain importance at different scales of our societies. When it comes to policy regimes, I think that still the systemic competitiveness framework helps, because on the national level, we need main incentives, macro level incentives. And policies which drive then the transformative processes from an educational perspective, from a technological perspective, from a shaping cities perspective. This needs to be based and needs to be anchored strongly in regions and cities as what we call the meso level. No? So the meso level is much more strongly related to regional dimensions than the main macro incentive scheme.
Do you see there a difference also in requirements for developing countries and industrialized countries to drive this agenda, nationally, internationally, but also locally? Because what we often experience is on the ground, when we are working on the ground, that there are different perspectives. One strong perspective is that these demands for a more transformative oriented development approach comes from outside, either from donors or from policymakers, can even be from the European Union because of certain funds which are available. So we find that there is sometimes missing a kind of bottom-up perspective when it comes towards pushing also, or with this normative perspective, bringing this agenda across. And on the other hand, we experience often that we are working with stakeholders which are very keen on promoting a new way of sustainable mixture of mixing economic development really with a more sustainable agenda. So we have got these perspectives often which we realize on the ground. And I would like to hear, how do you see that? What is the role here really of developing countries, or the difference also for developing countries and industrialized countries in that respect?
Okay. I mean, developing countries, of course, is a broad term. No? We are talking about countries which are very, very poor in sub-Saharan Africa towards Brazil or Mexico, emerging markets, so it's broad. No? But having this in mind for a second, my first sentence would be that I am observing that during the last 10 years, there have been a shift in perspective in many developing countries, that climate change is a threat for development in developing countries themselves. So India and African countries became a driver of change in the climate negotiations. Beforehand, in 1990, still 2000, Africa and India, countries like India and regions like Africa have not promoting the climate agenda, because their major feeling was that this is an issue which has to be solved anyway in developed countries. So do your business, it's up to you. No? And then step by step, many of these countries and their experts and their university systems understood that they are really threatened by the impacts of accelerated climate change. No? So I observe a shift in perspective here. And then when it comes to the transformation itself, regarding developing countries, 2 points. No? The first point is, in some countries, leapfrogging is easier than in OECD countries, which are very path dependent. No? So if you look at building renewable energy systems in rural areas in Africa, in many countries, this is already very successful. Or the same with the handy and mobile phone revolution in several African countries. No? So jumping directly into the new technologies. Leapfrogging is easier if you do not have this old industrial structure from the past. No? This is the first point. This is an advantage. But of course, there's also a huge challenge, and the huge challenge implies that sustainability transformation and building a sustainable economy is about building a knowledge-based economy, a technology-based economy. And this is about investments in education, investments in R&D. And as we all know, in most developing countries, we have weak systems in this regard and weak investments in this regard. No? And beyond technology and innovation and education, it's also about governance. So you will not get a transformation towards sustainability without effective governance systems. No? So these are the challenges. In the OECD world, the major challenge is to move away from a model which has been so successful in the past, in terms of wealth creation. And saying goodbye to a wealth creation machine is difficult for people who build these structures. We see this now in the coal industry. We are having the same debate in the automobile industry. In Germany, we have been the global masters in building the best cars of the world, of the past, but we do not drive the main transformation processes towards sustainable mobility. They are all driven in different parts of the world.
Yeah. You are working now. I mean, the interesting element is always to reflect with you is also you know the reality in countries outside Germany, but now you are heading the German Development Agency, also as a driver of this, let's say, this transformation within Germany. Which role do you see now also in your new post to connect these levels, to work at the national level, yes, to be a driver for this transformation in Germany, but also to link that with an international perspective, but also on the other hand with a local perspective. But what role do you see yourself in this?
Yeah, I mean, the agency, the German Environment Agency, has 4 major arenas of work. And then I'm coming to the levels of the local, the regional, and national. So we do research to understand environmental challenges and to develop solutions. So it's research-based, our work. The second element is based on that, we do policy advisory work. The third element is that we build actor constellations for change. This is very related already to your question. So on sector levels, for example, or with cities together, at European levels. I'm coming back to this in a second. And the fourth element is that the agency themselves implements science-based environmental policies. For example, the emission trading scheme, the European one, is executed for Germany in our agency. So this is how the organization works. And now when it comes to your question, this is related to the actor constellation question. We try to build actor constellations and work with actors to trigger and shape transformation processes. So we do not only do research and publish our papers, and we do not only talk to decision makers in ministries, the minister, the state secretary. We work with cities and on the level of cities and ask ourselves and then discuss with cities what they could deliver and how they could play a proactive role in transformation processes. And the same is true in the field of sectors. So we recently had in our agency in Dessau, where the Bauhaus movement started, we had a meeting with people from the agricultural sector. We also need to think about transformation processes of the agricultural industries and the sector as a whole. And we brought together all the different actors from this field, trying to build a consensus about the main limitations of the ecosystems we are talking about, and then to think about business models within these guardrails, ecological guardrails. So this is how we try to not only understand solutions and develop solutions and publish our solutions, but also build communication strategies and communication structures and actor constellations to shift patterns of this of change.
Mm. I'm coming to my last question, because we have not too much time. I mean, what we are often talking about is the need for, when you want to promote change, there is a need for strong bottom-up support, but also we call it intelligent top-down. So where you provide some space also for experimentation on the ground. And I would like to ask you, where do you see, where would be 3 good starting points to really bring together a strong bottom-up perspective and approach when it comes towards this sustainable transformation at the local level, with encouraging top-down perspective, intelligent top-down perspective?
When it comes to decision-making processes and the importance of local, national, and international levels, my point would be that we need obviously activities at all these levels. No? Mm-hmm. We said that nation states are driving global climate politics and international negotiations, and we need a global framework for that. So nation states and the international level are very important. Nations and governments need to decide upon decarbonization pathways. But then when it comes to the implementation of all of that, the investment in local and regional levels is very important. We talked at the beginning of our conversation about the relevance of urban areas. No? Climate scientists are demonstrating that 70% of all emissions are directly related to urban areas and cities. No? So if you would like to change decarbonization perspectives, you cannot only reflect and move on national levels. You need to mobilize cities and make cities drivers, and regional areas around the cities and urban agglomerations, make them important drivers of change. No? So this is one point which I wanted to emphasize. The second point is a more general one, but maybe also important, because I thought a lot about how can we motivate and mobilize actors on local and national levels, citizens, no? and companies on different levels, to become drivers of fundamental change. I mean, no one loves fundamental change because this destroys our routines. It's difficult. Incremental change is easy. We know how to do that. No? But fundamental change, I mean, we are living in a period where many people are already suffering acceleration of change, digitalization, globalization, the debate about refugees moving around the world, interconnectedness, so acceleration of change. No? And what we are arguing for is that we need even more acceleration, but towards sustainability. No one loves that, because it's challenging. And if you look into literature, and I think this can be related to our empirical experiences then also, there are 4 elements which you need to bring together. No? The first element is that to motivate people for fundamental change. No? The first element is that you need to convince people, citizens or mayors or CEOs of small and large firms, that there is a real problem. No? So if you cannot explain that there is a real problem, you will not convince no one to change fundamentally. No? In some sectors and some countries, we have been making progress in this regard. In other countries, it's different. So the problem dimension and making this as clear as possible is very important. The second point is then, you need to develop strategies and convince people that your strategies towards sustainability and decarbonization can really work. No? So if you describe a huge problem, but you cannot convince people that your strategy makes sense, you will not make great progress, no? Because this is about uncertainty. People do not like uncertainty. No? So Germany is a good example for bringing renewable energy systems forward. No? We are a very bad example for bringing and shaping mobility systems towards sustainability and decarbonization. So when I talk to people in Germany about mobility transformation, I'm talking about good examples which work, no? In other countries of the world.
To encourage,
so
but also to
demonstrate that it can work, no? to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty produces fear, and fear is a blockade for transformation processes. No? So demonstrating that it can work is number 2. Number 3 is that even though you could have demonstrated that it could work, people might ask or will ask, is this fair and just? Because many people have the feeling anyway that we are living in societies which are becoming more unjust and more unjust and more unjust, and driven by many processes. When I talk about mobility or also about meat consumption, what I'm listening often to is this might be a process of de-democratization of consumption. So people have the feeling sustainability, sustainability driving the de-democratization of consumption. The feeling is that this is not just. We might tackle climate change, but we might destroy our understanding of welfare and justice concerns. This is the third thing. So therefore, talking about an ecological transformation, not only about an ecological transformation, but a socio-ecological transformation. Fairness at the center is very important. If we don't get this right, we will not get the motivation and legitimacy for climate-driven and climate-compatible development processes. And the fourth element is maybe the most important one. Because if you look into history, when we had fundamental dynamics of change, it was always driven by an idea, by an utopia of how the world might look like. So the success of social democrats in the last century, the social democratic century, was that they had a different idea about the future. And having a good idea about how the future might look like, more just, with a higher level of standard of living, now with a stable ecosystem and a stable earth system, this is something which makes a huge difference. And many people forgot to think about, or are not any longer capable of imagine attractive futures. And I think this is very important. We do not only need to convince people that climate protection looks like this and that, and then we have the numbers, how to reduce carbon emissions and how to have new investments in renewable energies and different types of infrastructures, having attractive futures in mind, and developing with people attractive futures. This is what drives fundamental change. So these are the 4 major points which need to come together to invest into the motivation structures of cities and within companies, but also nations.
It's also very interesting or attractive, motivating for our work, because what we realize now also in our work is that we have to create new coalitions. We have to work together, maybe even also integrating also other stakeholders, which were normally not so much on the agenda of our work when it came to economic development. So what we are trying now also is to scan who are the drivers of we often call them outliers, who are having a different perspective, who are bringing maybe in also a more sustainability and, let's say, attractive future perspective into these processes of dialogues. I can remember when we met last time, we very strongly reflected also about how can we encourage dialogues with different kinds of drivers, but also with different kinds of interest representatives at the national level, at the international level, but also at the local level. And from that perspective, I hope that we have got more contact also in encouraging this process, encouraging these dialogues at these different levels which you mentioned. Yes, in that respect, thank you very much, Dirk. I really enjoyed this reflection with you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to have this chat. And all the best for the future for you and your team.
Thank you.